Welcome everyone to the path from Drupal developer to from developer to Drupal Evangelist. I know that we are preventing you from drinks and food, but we are going to do our best to make this highly entertaining, very energetic, keep everybody awake, and hopefully you'll all leave with some good insights. So today we're going to talk about our own personal paths from developers to something more senior, advanced, however you'd like to phrase it. We'll explore those senior roles and how they can sometimes be more sales related. We'll try to remove the stigma from that sales word as like, ew, dirty, bad. And we'll provide some tips to navigate that shift while staying true to your love for Drupal, because after all, that's why we're all here, right? As you can see from this slide, our slide's broken up into three major sections. A little intro and background on who we are and our experiences, the detailed view of the job, what it entails, what success looks like, and then finally we'll talk about where we are today. So there will be plenty of time, hopefully, at the end for questions and answers, but if you have something that's like burning a hole in your brain and you can't wait, feel free to raise your hand and we will try to take it in line if we can. All right, so let's do a little background and intro. I'm JohnPicozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM. I'm a co-organizer of the New England Drupal Camp, a co-host on the Talking Drupal podcast. I'm also a member of Drupal's Event Organizer Working Group. I've crafted solutions for CVS Caremark, Leica Geosystems, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Marriott International, and most recently Novartis. When I'm not working talking tech or the like, I like to cook, travel, and this time of year I'm coaching and watching a ton of baseball. Martin, tell the nice folks about yourself.
Hey everyone, Martin Anderson-Klutz, Principal Solutions Engineer at Acquia. Been with Acquia a little over 4 years, came from a partner agency, so I've been working with their products for over a decade. Currently involved in planning the Southwest Ontario Drupal Camp, so anybody who's going to be in that neighborhood in October, hopefully you'll stop by and join us. But worked with a variety of other community initiatives, including, speaking a lot of camps like this one.
Okay, so today is Martin's birthday. Woo. So let's all say happy birthday to Martin.
Happy birthday, Martin.
Now, as we go through our talk, I thought it would be fun. I took it upon myself to add this birthday hat to some pictures of Martin throughout our presentation. So, if you see the birthday hat, just scream out, "Happy birthday, Martin."
Like Pee-wee's Playhouse? Or?
Yes, exactly. Exactly like that. That's the way we're going here. Okay, so a little bit more background about me and some history about where I got started, where I come from. So my love for the web, my journey, as it were, started with independent study in high school. We had the opportunity to do an independent study. I had this book about building, designing websites. I was like, cool, I'm going to do my independent study on this. I then went to college and actually in college got a degree in web development, internet commerce, continued that love of building websites, solving problems. But while I was in high school and in college, I actually worked for Marriott in hospitality, carrying bags and parking cars. And I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. Out of college, my first job was working in a startup. I realized this wasn't for me, per se. And then I moved to smaller agencies where I spent the next 10 plus years of my career. In those agencies, I started as a developer. I then moved up to senior developer, solutions architect, and before I moved to EPAM, I was an account manager. Since then, I moved to EPAM. That was about 4 years ago, and I'm currently a solutions architect.
All right, and what probably not everyone knows about you, I mean, for starters, that's actually a picture of me from 17 years and 1 day ago, exactly. But actually, I started off out of school as a graphic designer, and then I had some colleagues who were telling me I should really start looking into this web stuff because HTML was not that hard to write and people were paying a lot of money for it. But it never seemed super interesting to me until I started seeing websites built in a thing called Macromedia Flash that some people might remember. And it was super cool. And so I got excited about it, started learning how to build sites with it. Eventually, the path for me was that I started wanting to do more and more complicated things, and I didn't know people that could do that for me. So I ended up having to sort of teach myself how to do things like eventually learning PHP, eventually doing some DevOps things that I still would rather not touch if I had the opportunity. But along the way, at one point I had built my own CMS that was this kind of an abomination that used like XML and XSLT and all of these like very complicated things. And I had a project that I needed to work on that needed to manage content in 5 languages with version control. And I decided that I wanted no part in having to code all of that. And so I went online, I found the CMS that was best for managing content in multiple languages, and it was definitely Drupal. And as I started to use it, I felt like it was easy to use. It seemed like it provided a lot of capabilities that I certainly knew for myself would have been difficult to create and manage on my own. The other thing is, along my path, I also, similar to John, worked for small agencies. I actually kind of had my own very small shop at one point, and I feel like in any small agency, but particularly if you are sort of, in that role of being the primary person who's actually not only selling the stuff, but actually developing it, having the client conversations, you develop a lot more empathy. So number one, you don't see the salespeople as sort of like out to undercut you. I feel like some developers have this perception of salespeople that they just want to get the project at whatever cost and don't care that, that leads to downstream problems if it isn't sold for as much as it's actually going to require. And also think that they, maybe don't care about like actually getting good requirements and some of those other things, which, again, once you're having those conversations and party to them, I definitely feel like you get a much better perspective. But all of that has led me to eventually becoming a developer, but then also sort of doing a bit of a pivot and getting into more gradually sales-oriented roles, as part of my own evolution.
Happy birthday!
All right, so you may be wondering what actually makes someone a good Drupal evangelist. Well, it's a few things. So number one, you kind of want to be able to do it. Like part of it can come out of feeling like, okay, I've spent enough time doing the sort of pure coding thing, and maybe I want to start to develop some new skills. But on the other hand, there are people who just love writing code, going into that deep level and solving problems, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But if you start to feel like maybe you're ready to take on some new challenges, then moving into a different role can definitely be a good way to do that. Certainly, you may also find that you start to develop some fatigue around constantly learning, the new ways to implement the same things. Some people find that really fascinating. I personally, love learning as part of the different things that I do. But you may get to a point where you're like, maybe more managing people as sort of, something that I don't need to constantly relearn. There are, some of those skills that you might be interested in learning. But one of the things that I love about the position is that I get to sort of focus on different questions. So where I used to constantly be talking to people about, how to implement something and when it would get done, I get to have conversations about what should we implement and why, and really taking it back to business value and some of those other things. And so to me, that's a big part of why I love being in this new role. Certainly, you're going to want to have good soft skills. So, being good with people, being able to, approach them with empathy, to be able to speak on their level and not sort of use Drupalisms and technical speak is going to be really important. And there's this great quote by Einstein that says, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And then the last one is being able to be good at public speaking. So you don't necessarily have to come to conferences and present, but certainly to be able to stand in front of a room of people and speak to, why a technical approach is something that you're willing to stand behind, or some of these other things. Now, you don't have to necessarily be a natural speaker to be good at this role. That's definitely a skill that you can develop, and certainly that was true for me. Also, to be able to, communicate clearly. So to be able to speak with confidence, to be able to, just get your point across in sort of a concise way. And there was a former client that said perfect is the enemy of good enough. So, definitely being able to not obsess over, how would we build this if we had $1 million, but say, given the constraints of this project, what's going to sort of get us as close as possible to what the customer needs?
How many folks here had like an early job in like retail or waiting tables or, right? So my early job, as I mentioned, was working in a hotel, working in hospitality, being a bellman. And I definitely pull a lot of those soft skills and that public speaking stuff from that experience, right? I talked to a bunch of people, year in, year out, right? And that job really kind of helped me develop those skills right up until a point, like I used to do it off and on right up until about a year ago, just because it was a change of pace and it kept me engaged and kept me building those soft skills. So I definitely agree with Martin. Those things are important. All right, let's talk about, is the Drupal Evangelist role right for me? What does that mean? What does that look like? Well, first things first, does it make you happy? I'm a firm believer in that you should be doing something that brings you joy. If you wake up every day and you go, ugh, I got to go to work, maybe you're not doing the right thing. Just saying. Is it something you want to do every day? Right? Like, like I just said, does it bring you joy? Is selling Drupal like in your DNA? Do you want to be the guy that's like, hey, I want to sell you this great CMS? Do you want to even build business? Like, is that something that you want to do? Some developers really just want to develop. They just want to write code all day. And they don't want to worry about the business end of things. And that's completely fine. If you get to the answer like, no, it's not going to make me happy, that's completely fine. You figured it out early. Like, bonus to you. You don't have to kind of go on the journey to figure out that you don't want to do it. You've already figured it out. One thing that folks worry about is skills rot. Like, as you kind of move further away from the code, they feel like, oh, my skills are going to deteriorate. As you can see from this chart, as Martin and I's careers kind of have advanced, our skills have decreased drastically. Obviously, this is false. If anything, our skills have probably enhanced. Our outlooks on things and bringing different technologies has increased. The reason I bring this up is because I went to a talk quite a few years ago, very similar to this one. And the presenter kind of started out by saying, like, your skills are going to deteriorate. Just get used to it. As you move up into management or up into sales or up into whatever the next thing is, they're going to deteriorate. And, I definitely don't find this to be true.
Yeah, I've definitely built a lot of Drupal sites specifically for demos and learned a lot in that process. So, certainly one of the things that I have found in this role is that where, in more of a developer sort of project-based role, I might only get to work on 1, maybe 2 projects in a year because it's not uncommon for, an enterprise Drupal build to take, 6, 9, sometimes 12 months. Whereas in a sales role, sometimes I'm building a demo and I've only got, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, sometimes even less than a week to throw something together. And sometimes there's novel challenges in there that I have to be able to learn to adapt to quickly and develop solutions for. So it certainly forces you to be a little bit more agile in your thinking. But on top of that, the ability to sort of engage trainings and stay on top of, like, there's podcasts that you can listen to. I heard there's a really good one about Drupal that.
It's all right.
Do a module of the week.
That sounds great.
We do, yeah. So I think like POCs are where I find some of my most beneficial outcomes is where I'm doing a proof of concept for a client. I'm finding new modules. I'm finding new services. I'm bringing them into Drupal. I'm showing to them, and they're like, "Oh, this is great!" Right? definitely helping me to avoid that skills rot. As Martin said, podcasts, webinars are a great way to not only take in content that can help you avoid that, but also, like, selfishly, one of the things I use my own podcast for is bringing people in that I need to know more information on topics that I need to know more information about, right? So building content that I'm like, oh, all right, I need to know more about this. Let me bring somebody on to talk to them about it, right? Tinkering in personal sites, blogging, that is super, super important and a great way to avoid that skills rot. My personal site is, I actually just wrote a blog post about how my personal site, my transactional email had broke. I had to go and figure out, what am I going to do to replace my transactional email service? What am I going to use? It was a great learning experience to say, hey, now I know more transactional email providers to provide to clients. I know that there's great Drupal modules that I'll be able to install. So those are all great ways to avoid that skills rot. Martin obviously does a lot of project maintainership, right? And you find that a great way to prevent the skills rot, stay up on what's happening in the community. And then last but not least, Drupal initiatives. If you're involved in initiatives, not only can it help you with that sales piece of the job and saying like, hey, there are great things coming in Drupal, like recipes and experience builder, but it also keeps you kind of locked into the community and what's coming, what's new.
Yeah, I'll just maybe add quickly that both project maintainership as well as being involved in Drupal initiatives also gives you the chance to collaborate with some like absolutely brilliant folks in the community and learn from them in terms of like, oftentimes they'll be like, hey, you implemented this, it kind of works, but like this is actually the proper way to do that, and that can again be a really good way to sort of continue to develop your skills overall.
So the one thing to remember here is you can always go back. You can always go back to where you came from. Matter of fact, I did it. I realized at my last company, after being an account manager for a year, that I was like, I'm too far away from actually building the solution and working with the dev team. I want to go back to being a solutions architect. I would say that if you're going to take that approach, don't think of it as kind of like a reductive going backwards sort of thing. Think of it as, okay, well, I want to go back into this role. How can I challenge myself? So for me, I went from working for small agencies to working for a company that has over 62,000 employees and is a global entity, right? That is a completely different playing field than where I was before. I think that, it's important to know that going back is okay. Like, you can do it, and it can be beneficial to your career. It can be beneficial to, getting you to that next level. I also went from being like a Drupal subject matter expert to more of an enterprise architect. EPAM works with a ton of different technologies, and I have a ton of smart people in those technologies I can bounce questions off of. So now, instead of saying like, oh, we're just building Drupal sites, we're actually building Drupal as a platform that integrates with Salesforce. It integrates with all these other systems. So I'm definitely broadening my horizons, even though I've gone back to solutions architecture.
So you might be wondering, what are the actual things that I need to do to be able to be successful should you choose to sort of move into this new role? So certainly continuing to evolve is a really important one. So, there are stereotypes about developers, and, take it upon yourself to sort of break out of that role. So, there's a stereotype that devs can't talk to clients, and certainly, being comfortable enough, feeling, comfortable in your skin and knowing that you have the expertise to sort of answer their questions, again, in that way that doesn't lapse into sort of technical jargon speak, is definitely critical. There's this idea that devs are most comfortable sort of, like maybe even sitting in the dark by the glow of their CRT or something. But, devs love sunshine too. So, being out there, getting into customer meetings and really, again, developing the comfort of just, having that interaction and talking to, questions that might arise, and some of those things is important. You might need to upgrade your wardrobe. So, always wearing like Drupal conference tees to customer meetings is probably something that, maybe invest in a button-down shirt or two, something like that, just to dress it up a little, particularly for new business meetings. And again, get into the habit of being able to explain things in ways that don't require technical understanding, that idea of being able to explain it simply. We've already talked about the importance of always being learning, and it's really, sort of a mindset that you need to get into. So, POCs and demos, trainings, but also learned experiences. And even though, maybe you're doing less development on a day-to-day basis, being able to draw on sort of the experience both of the developers that you're continuing to work with, but also, some of the other salespeople. So in my role, I work with a lot of SEs who don't necessarily do a lot of, or have a lot of Drupal experience in their background, but I'm always learning from them in terms of what are the ways to be a better communicator and to get ideas across and connect with people emotionally with some of the ideas that you want to get across. And then there's the opportunity to learn, specifics of other industries. So, as I've moved into working at Acquia, learning about, HIPAA compliance and FedRAMP and, PCI and some of these other things that I didn't necessarily have a ton of exposure for, but, again, you have that ability to continue to learn and develop. And then certainly within Drupal, there's always opportunities to learn about what are some of the new things that are, the community is working on currently, but maybe just starting to work on. So, Drupal CMS, the AI initiative this year, Experience Builder is something that's due out later this year, new major versions of Drupal now coming every 2 years, and then just all of the new approaches in terms of how you can implement things within Drupal as well. And definitely for myself, being able to give compelling demos is definitely really important. And I think that the biggest learning for me was that a demo is really about storytelling. So it's, I think it's very easy as developers to think it's all about showing off features that you've been able to sort of, get to a point where they're ready to show, but it's really most important to tell a story about who's the person that needs to be able to use certain features and what's their experience going to look like. So, within Drupal, it can be simple things like don't demo things as user one, because that shows every capability and it looks bewildering to a lot of people. So actually create a user account that's in the content creator role and show what's the experience of actually using it from that standpoint. Remember to use personas, as part of that. So again, having talked to the customer, understood who are the different types of people that are actually going to be using the system, showing it from a user account that's configured to that is really communicating what that experience is going to be like for those people. Certainly, we're a big advocate of using what we call a tell, show, tell structure. So the idea of introducing something by explaining, this is the requirement that we talked about, here's what you're going to see, actually showing it to them in action, and then summarizing it by, again, sort of repeating what it is that they've just seen really helps it to be memorable, because that idea of, people need to receive something 3 times often before they really commit it to memory. And also understand that a demo is really the art of the possible. So maybe not everything that they see, particularly in a new business pitch, is something that is going to be in the final solution that they'll actually sort of purchase or have built for them, but really being able to excite them with things that maybe are going to be further down the road as part of their solution, I think is also important. Definitely you want to prepare for your demo. So personally, I always write out a script of the actual path that I want to follow. One of the things that I like to think about is kind of like knowing where the bodies are buried, because oftentimes in a demo there are certain things that will blow up if you do them, and so knowing what those things are and having sort of the click-by-click steps to follow and making sure that you don't deviate from that during your demo can be very important. And certainly rehearsing your demo multiple times is going to help you have that confidence of knowing exactly the flow that you can use and be confident that it's not going to go off the rails. Oftentimes, a customer may have a huge set of requirements in terms of what they want to see in a demo. But, particularly if you're constrained with time, and, oftentimes that is the case, it can be more impactful to show fewer things, but in a more polished and well-rehearsed way, rather than trying to do a bunch of things and then, a few of them kind of go off the rails and blow up. So, sort of finding that balance is definitely important. Doing things like having a stable internet connection, where you can use wired connections instead of wireless. All of these are sort of, technical aspects. Even things like, when you share your screen, if you have some like 24-inch monitor, don't share the whole thing, but just share like one window so that people on smaller screens watching your demo don't see like illegible text because everything is so small. Some other things from a showmanship standpoint, that's a lot of S's. Try and remember to smile. Like, even if you're off camera, they say that if you are smiling when you're talking, it comes across more warmly in your voice. People can actually tell the difference. Another thing is, invariably, something probably will go wrong in your demo. So, I have a colleague who likes to say, if nothing goes wrong in a live demo, you should be suspicious as to whether or not it was actually a live demo. And that's sort of a fun thing to say when things go wrong, and people are generally pretty understanding if one or two things kind of go off the rails. So just roll with it, keep going, and don't get sort of thrown off by it. And then the last thing is, because it's really about storytelling, as you're going through, try and pause every so often and ask unstructured questions. So say something like, how does this compare to the solution that you're using today? Or maybe, you talked at the beginning about some of the aspirations that you have for your new CMS. How does this line up with some of the things that you had in mind? And really get them talking. And that's definitely more engaging for people than just sort of sitting back passively and listening to you talk as you go through your demo.
Yeah, I think a lot of those points not only apply to demos, but also apply to pitch meetings, RFP response meetings, those sorts of things. One thing I like to do is look around the room, right? If you're in a room with somebody, make sure you're looking at body language. You can automatically see when you're looking at people, whether they're like into what you're saying or they're like, he's not really hitting the marks here. And, as Martin said with those questions, if you ask those guided questions, sometimes you can re-engage people to say like, oh, now he's getting it. Now we're going down the right path. One thing I love to do with my clients is always putting the client first. I like to stay close to my values and do what's best for the client, and ultimately as a solution architect, the user. Right? I always like to think about like how a user is going to use the platform that I'm building, and say like, okay, well, if they're going to use it like this, we need to do this, this, and this. Sometimes my development team doesn't love that, but it lends itself to a better outcome both for the client and for the software. I often tell clients, like, hey, if I'm not being effective in my role, or if I'm not being useful on this project, then I need to go. We need to make a change, right? So, like, that's keeping the client first and foremost. Don't be afraid to lose business. Being truthful, being honest, being upfront with the clients will allow you to develop, hopefully, a relationship that's long-lasting. But sometimes there are external factors. There are things outside of your control that force the client to go somewhere else. Don't worry. Usually they'll come back. I like to say, like, we need to provide value to our clients. And I always tell people, remember, value isn't dollars and cents. It's not saving them money. I mean, don't get me wrong. Saving money is good. And if you can do it for your client, you should. But value is more than just the dollars and cents. I like to not be the smartest person in the room. Often I like to try to be the dumbest person in the room, or at least I think I am. Because we've all been in rooms where there's a person that thinks they're the smartest person. And through conversation, by the end of that conversation, you're like, well, they kind of prove that they're not necessarily the smartest person in the room, right? Lead with facts, lead with data, and then be sure of what you're talking about. Going back to the quote from a couple of slides ago, right? If you understand something, you know something, it's going to be a lot easier for you to explain it. Last but certainly not least, thinking outside the box. Sometimes you have to push the limits of Drupal. Remember, there's a module for that, right? It's one of the best parts of the Drupal community, right? But also remember, if there isn't a module, we can build one, right? As I said earlier, our company connects to a lot of different systems through Drupal. I like to consider Drupal as like a traffic cop or glue, right? Bringing a lot of different data sources, a lot of different systems together. But sometimes Drupal isn't the best solution. I know, it's hard to hear, but it's true. Sometimes you just have to go, maybe Drupal isn't best for this. Maybe we should go integrate with another service. Maybe we can bring that data into Drupal via APIs. putting the client first, like building that value, I like to look at it as being a trusted advisor to your client. So back in my account management days, I read this book, The Trusted Advisor, and it was great. It really gave me insight as to how to build very effective relationships with clients and decision makers within organizations. And at the root of it, it's sometimes telling the clients things they don't want to hear, or advising them like, hey, we might not be the best fit for this. Ultimately, they may not love what you're telling them, but they'll appreciate the honesty and the realness that you're bringing to the conversation. Recommend this book. If you hit that QR code there, it'll take you to Amazon to buy it. I do not get any proceeds from that link, so feel free to click away. So, where are we today? Well, as I said, I'm a solutions architect working for a large company. Sometimes I am doing sales and RFP responses. I'm pulling back in that account management background. But day to day, I'm working with devs and creating great solutions for our clients. As I said, I realized that the account management thing wasn't right for me, but I still do love the RFP response and trying to solve people's problems. But I also love solutioning. Helping to build things that solve those problems in the best way humanly possible. I will say that if anybody's out there that works for a small agency right now, moving to a large agency is like vastly different. It's a whole new world. I actually sometimes will tell people when I give talks like this, I kind of wished I'd done it earlier or I'd done it sooner in my career, because I feel like it would have been like a force multiplier for the rest of my career.
All right, and as you've already heard, I'm currently a principal solutions engineer at Acquia. The thing I love about it is I feel like it gives me the opportunity to get in front of people that are shopping around for different CMS solutions and really talk about why they should be excited about the potential that they have in using Drupal. Certainly I love being able to travel around and come to different camps and conferences, do some occasional blogging, and for me, I really find the work of appearing on the Talking Drupal podcast amazing, because my own work in terms of maintaining projects definitely makes me appreciative of all of the work that other people do to maintain projects of their own. So being able to showcase those, bring visibility to them, I feel like I just love being able to do that, and certainly I get a lot of feedback that people value that segment as well. But yeah, the projects that I maintain, again, I love being able to sort of play around with different ideas. Sometimes they come from different demos. Like I have had requirements where somebody said, we need to embed Google Maps inside our WYSIWYG, and I'm like, that seems bonkers to me, and I don't see why you should need to do that, but can we make that work? Yes. And so there is a sandbox module on Drupal for doing exactly that. But lots of times I'll make something and then I'm like, with just a little tweaking, I could see making that as something that if people need to do this other, weird thing, then you can do that, and it's fun to just sort of contribute that back, again, as part of the work that I do on a daily basis.
Happy birthday, Mars.
And where are you?
Oh, this is an AI-generated image. That is definitely actually not me, but it was.
I don't know. It was pretty close.
I was with AI on a mountaintop. Anyway, it's a long story.
Your dreams.
But before we open it up to questions, just underscore. John already mentioned that we're standing between you and drinks and food, but. On that topic, there is a party that Acquia is sponsoring later this afternoon, so would love to see you all there. Any questions?
Oh, there's one in the back.
Sure. I guess what I'm hearing in terms of Drupal Evangelist, all these different sounding like self-assigned, claim types, but not really. They are, where do you consider, or how does one go from like a Drupal SME? What's the tipping point, I guess, to get from there to being an evangelist? from your experience? Like Martin, you've been working for 17 years and pretty much being with Drupal the whole time. Is there a certain point in your career where you feel like, now I'm that person, Drupal Evangelist?
I mean, I think for me, it started real early. I remember one of my first jobs was with a small agency, and there was a little bit of an economic downturn, and the CEO came in and said, "Hey, would you be upset if you had to work on WordPress sites?" And I said, would I be upset? I mean, if it comes between me working on WordPress sites and not having a job and being able to feed my family, then yeah, I guess I'll work on WordPress sites. I won't necessarily be thrilled about it, but I'll do it because that's what I need to do, right? So, I mean, I think for me, the evangelism of Drupal started real early. I think as you grow in your career, it just takes it takes on different shapes and forms, right? So that was kind of in a very early form. Nowadays, it's more of an educational and, art of the possible, as Martin said, of what Drupal can do, what is possible with Drupal, and hey, this isn't Drupal 5 or 6, this is Drupal 9, 10, or 11, right? And we can do some amazing things with it, and just educating people as to what that possibilities are.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say from my own experience, I can definitely remember an agency that I used to work at. At the time, my role was, I think my job title was technically Drupal architect, but it was sort of like a solutions architect at a lot of places. And I had sort of two colleagues, so there were three of us that were sort of in that role, and it was very clear that the other two had no interest in participating in any kind of new business process, and so I ended up taking on a lot of that work, and I think that is sort of how I sort of eventually, that became sort of like a half, essentially, of the work that I was doing. So sometimes you may find that there are opportunities to take that on because there may be other people, again, who just really enjoy development and really want to stay more development focused. So if it's something you're interested in, there may be an opportunity to talk to your supervisor or whatever and say hey, this is something I'd like to start getting into, and then you can probably figure out it doesn't have to be, as you say, a tipping point of I'm this and now all of a sudden I'm this. It's you can probably start to sort of ease into that, get some comfort level. The other thing I would say is I've found it really helpful to try and develop partnership with sort of the salespeople that I work with to understand, because again, John was talking about reading the room and some of those other kinds of things, they may be able to say, when you got to this part of the demo, everybody's eyes glazed over and whatever, right? So being able to have that conversation and feedback by somebody who's maybe seeing it a little bit more impartially can also help you to develop some of those skills as well.
I will say, to double down on that, there are also instances where your account managers and your sales folks can kind of guide you into what the client is going to find interesting, and maybe it's not hey, let me tell you about Drupal APIs, because oh boy, right? Maybe it's more hey, look at this cool feature that allows you to generate alt text with AI, right? And they can kind of help coach you in how to massage your content to be more appealing to those clients as well.
You actually bring up an interesting point, because in the past many of these meetings would have been face-to-face, and it's kind of a different thing to scan and read body language. And when you talk about what the prior baseline is before you start talking about Drupal, how can you do that when you're doing something more like a online? Is there a technique that works?
Yeah. So I mean, for me, digital is definitely harder. And if you're doing a webinar, for example, it's 10x multiplier, because you literally have no feedback from anybody, right?
So even a Zoom where you're presenting.
But typically what I like to do is I like to make sure my camera's on and try to encourage people to put their cameras on so I can at least see some people's faces.
So
but I will say, I double down on what Martin said, asking questions, right? So stopping at certain points, saying, hey, does this make sense? Hey, does this solve problem X that you had? Hey, does this meet this requirement? And kind of getting them oh, he asked a question, I got to be paying attention now. If he does it again, I don't want to be asleep at the switch, right? So I think there are ways you can adjust your presentation style to meet a in-person versus a digital experience.
The only thing that I'll add to that is that another thing that can be really effective is actually, instead of just asking a question broadly of like, hey, does anybody, can anybody comment on how this, would meet your needs, to say like, hey, Phil, what do you think? Because usually you'll do introductions at the start, and so if somebody's like the communications manager, you can say like, how would this meet the communications team's need, Phil? And then so once you start to call out people individually, number one, like that person has they're sort of really challenged, but then everybody else will be kind of on notice, because it's like if they're the one that gets called next, they actually have to be listening and paying attention too. So
just make sure that person's not too far up on the decision-making food chain, because you never want to annoy those people.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, following on with that, that it might be helpful, to kind of set expectations at the beginning of a presentation too, that, hey, I want this to be interactive. I'm going to pause from time to time to ask specific questions and to make sure that we're on the same wavelength about things, and that way they're a little bit prepared for you to ask those questions then as well.
Yeah, I tend to do that a lot, but it also depends on the format and the content you're delivering, right? So in a demo format, it's a lot easier to say, hey, this is how we're going to operate. In an RFP response format, it's a little bit harder to be like, hey, we're going to stop and ask you guys questions, because in reality, we're just supposed to be really delivering you what the response is to the RFP.
Right.
So, I think that it depends on the scenario, but yeah, I would totally agree with that, and kind of framing that up front, setting expectations up front. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say I've actually been in at least one RFP response presentation where the procurement had it so structured that we did the demo up front. The client people who were present were not allowed to react in any way. Then they went away and had a 20-minute internal discussion, and then came back, and then it was a Q&A section completely separate. So sometimes you'll get into these weird scenarios where you don't really have a lot of control, but generally, yeah. Keeping it interactive is definitely the best practice.
Typically, you know that up front, so you can kind of prepare for it, but yeah, that's unnerving for sure. Good.
And I'm also curious about, because it seems like a lot of what you're talking about here is the move into solutions architecture kind of stuff. How, and maybe this is just a semantic thing, but I'm just curious. I've seen positions posted about sales engineer or things like that. How that would compare.
Yeah. So I can't speak for every company on the face of the earth, but.
No, you need to.
Oh well, in that case, I think there are different things in different places, right? So, a solution architect at EPAM is somebody who is working with the dev team, crafting solutions, doing those POCs. Might write a little bit of code, might make a couple of commits here and there, but not necessarily day-to-day delivering code, right? And doing those POCs, doing that stuff kind of gets you to that level where you're like, hey, I'm basically an advisor to the client as to what best practices are. Sometimes it is a sales engineer, because what'll end up happening is that'll be more the account manager isn't overly technical, and they need somebody to kind of be able to sell the sales side of it. And would you say that's probably more of what you do, Martin?
It's an interesting question, because I feel even within my team, there are some of us that are more new business focused, and some of us that are, working more closely with existing teams. And then even through the year, you might go through certain phases where you're doing a lot of RFP responses, or where you're very focused on just working with existing customers or different things. So it's I wouldn't say there's any kind of uniform answer, and you could have one company that calls it sales engineer, but you're actually doing a little bit more in terms of building things and that stuff, and other ones might call it a solutions architect, but anyway, it's you can't always really tell by the role, because it's very subjective, and sometimes it's more procurement that's actually deciding those, or HR. So
yeah.
I wouldn't always put too much stock in just a rose by the other name. Yeah.
I would also if you're interviewing for that, I would make sure that you ask very pointed questions as to okay, express what the daily looks like here.
Yeah.
Is it hey, 50% coding, 50% sales, or what's the makeup there?
Yeah.
Jake.
Say 50% coding, 50% sales. Both of you are evangelists in your company and evangelists in the Drupal community. You do a lot of you have that. How did you navigate that with your current employer or past employers. Even in negotiating, you're talking about a job.
Yeah.
And I'm just, even my anecdotal experience, I see people quotes saying you can contribute, and then it's a very vague statement.
Yeah, so obviously, like at least once a week, there's an hour and a half to 2 hours where I'm recording a podcast on company time, right? So that piece of it, to me, is something that was, I don't want to say non-negotiable, but it's something, again, in that interview process, I'm saying, well, here's how I'm involved in the community. Here's what I'm doing. Like, I like to make sure I'm at DrupalCon. I like to make sure, like, I have a podcast I need to record. And just having that conversation up front openly, right? Like, here's my expectation. Is this going to be a problem? Typically, employers are like, no. We have X number of hours per week. You can do what you want with, so on and so forth. There was a point in time earlier on where some of the smaller companies were like, you got to kind of make sure you're billing a certain amount of hours, per week. And I would say, well, all right. And, either build it into my workday to say, hey, I'm going to work an extra 15 minutes per day. So that way when that hour and a half comes, like, it's not a big deal. But over time, I was able to, like, convince the powers that be, like, no, you should just let me do this because, at the end of the day, I am promoting your organization, right? But I think open and honest communication is the salient point there. Is like make sure you're having that in the interview process so that both sides kind of like understand. Yes, this is what we are agreeing to.
Yeah, I would say from my standpoint, when I started my current role, there wasn't really any sort of like implicit like there's a chunk of my time that's like meant to be for a contribution or anything like that. I would love to have that. But certainly to the extent that I have built things that are potentially useful to other people in the community, there's never been any hesitation about like saying can that be contributed back, because it's not billable work anyway that I personally do, and so from that standpoint it's an easier conversation. Certainly in terms of things like as John was saying, having time that every week I'm spending being involved in the podcast. That was something that happened after I started. So it's a conversation that I had with my supervisor to say like, hey, here's this thing. Is that cool from a overall time management standpoint? And I feel like particularly in my role, the focus is really on getting done what needs to be done, as opposed to like watching hours and time tracking and all that kind of stuff. And that actually, I'm going to be honest, is like one of the things that I absolutely love about my role is not having to do timesheets anymore.
Who likes a bragger?
That's fair. But even in terms of things like going to camps and conferences, like when I started, I very rarely went to any, and then it just kind of grew over time. I sort of tried to do some internal advocacy of like, hey, maybe Acquia should be a little more visible at some of these events and things. And then as the opportunities came up, I was also like submitting talks, and then that made it easier. But even within Acquia, there are different teams that find it easier or more difficult to get out to events and some of those things. So it's sort of like, I feel like there's some degree of sort of trying to work your role to be what you want it to be, and having that conversation with your supervisor. But to your point, if you're looking at making a job switch, then having that conversation as part of the hiring process is definitely going to give you that clarity. Definitely don't wait until after you've been hired to be like, oh, what's your policy about getting sent out to Drupal camps? And they'll be like, oh no, we never do that. So yeah, again, I'll underscore open and honest communication. I think is really key to all of that. But I see we are over time. Don't want to spend any more time keeping people away from your drinks.
I mean, unless you have questions that you need us to answer right now.
Right now.
No, everybody's good. Okay, I'm gonna hit the